Angela could not speak. She entered therapy at the age of 30 because she had grave difficulty relating with anyone intimately. She was a competent teacher who could lecture her students with smooth eloquence. But from the moment she started to relate with me, Angela became tongue-tied. Long periods of silence were occasionally interspersed with brief spasms of almost unintelligible speech. When she attempted to talk, she would often break into gasping sobs after only a few words. Initially, I felt these sobs reflected overwhelming sadness, but gradually I realized they were a mechanism designed to prevent her from being articulate. Angela acknowledged she had similar difficulty speaking in all her intimate relationships, but the problem was clearly at its worst with me. It was also clear I represented an authority figure, a parental figure, for her. Angela's father had deserted the family when she was 5. She could only remember being raised by her mother. Her mother was an odd woman. When Angela, who was Italian, was a dark-haired little girl of 11, her mother made her dye her hair blonde. Angela had not wanted her hair dyed. She liked her black hair. But for some reason her mother wanted to have a blonde child. So a blonde child she had. The incident was typical. Her mother seemed to have little capacity or desire to recognize Angela as a separate human being in her own right. Angela had, for instance, no privacy. Although she had her own room, her mother strictly forbade her to close her door. Angela never understood the reason for this prohibition, but it was useless to argue against it. Once, at the age of 14, she tried. Her mother went into a depression that lasted over a month, during which time Angela had to do all the cooking and take care of her baby brother. The first term we developed for Angela's mother was intrusive. She was unredeemably intrusive. She had no hesitation about intruding on Angela's person or privacy, and would tolerate no interference with her intrusiveness. In the second year of Angela's therapy, we were able to relate her difficulty in talking to her mother's intrusiveness. Angela's silence was a moat that her mother could not cross. No matter how much her mother desired to intrude upon Angela's thought as well as her person, Angela could preserve the privacy of her mind through silence. Whenever her mother attempted to invade this privacy, Angela became tongue-tied. We also discovered that this moat of silence not only served to keep her mother out, but also to keep Angela's anger in. Psychotherapy is, of course, a highly intrusive process, and given the fact that I was in a parental role to her, it is no wonder that Angela dramatically reactivated the moat of silence that she had dug during her childhood. Only after she learned there was an essential difference between me and her mother was she able to speak freely with me. But she was still not free from her mother. Having married a man who, like her father, had then deserted her, Angela, with a child to support, had to rely on her mother for occasional financial assistance. More important, she still clung to the hope that somehow, someday, her mother would change and would appreciate her for who she was. It was at this point, in the beginning of the third year of therapy, that Angela recounted to me the following dream. I was in a building. Some kind of occult group came in wearing white robes. Somehow I was supposed to be a part of their scary ritual. I was captive in the situation. It was very unpleasant. "What ideas do you have about the dream?" I asked. "Oh, I know perfectly well where it came from," Angela responded. "Last week at a party, there was a couple who had been to Haiti. They were describing their visit to a voodoo place that had stones with bloodstains and chicken feathers all around. I felt horrified listening to them talk about the scene. I'm sure that's why I had the dream. It was sort of like a voodoo ritual, and it was like I was going to be forced to kill something. Yet somehow I was also going to be the victim. The dream was gory, ugly, There was something evil there. I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Perhaps there's something evil going on in your life at the present time, I commented. No, Angela protested. It's just that stupid dream, and I wish we could get off the subject. Do you think there's anything evil about your mother, I wondered. Sick, not evil, Angela replied. What's the difference? Angela did not answer this question directly. Actually, I am angry at my mother for the 10 millionth time. Oh? Tell me about it. Well, my car died on me last month. I was able to borrow enough money from the bank to make a down payment on my new one, but I don't have enough money to make the interest payments. So I called up my mother and asked if she could make me a $1,000 interest-free loan. She was really nice about it at the time. Of course, she said. But then the money didn't come. So after a couple of weeks, I called her again. She gave me some story about how she couldn't give it to me for another 2 weeks, or she would lose bank interest. I began to realize she probably didn't want to lend me the money, although she wasn't going to say so. Then last week I got a phone call from my brother. We've talked about how she always uses him to give me messages she doesn't want to give me herself. Anyway, he just wanted to let me know that my mother maybe had a lump in her breast and maybe would have to have surgery. He said Mother was worried she wouldn't have enough money to take care of her medical needs in her old age. By this time, the picture was becoming clear. Finally, 3 days ago, I received a formal promissory note from my mother for me to sign for the loan. I know she didn't expect me to sign it. A year or so ago, I wouldn't have. But fuck her. I need the money, and I have no other way to get it. So I signed it. But I still feel guilty. You say a year ago you wouldn't have signed it, I asked. I would have felt too guilty. But my therapy has made me realize this is just a typical game of hers. She's always about to go into the hospital. She's always about to have surgery. She always offers me something with one hand and pulls it away with the other. How many times would you say your mother's played this sort of game with you? I don't know. Hundreds, maybe even thousands. It's really a kind of ritual then, isn't it? It sure is. So you have been engaged in an evil ritual lately, haven't you? I commented. Angela looked at me with dawning recognition. You think that's what the dream's all about? I think so, I replied. Even though you've been through this sort of ritual hundreds of times, even though you know she wants you to feel guilty, she still manages to succeed, doesn't she? You still feel guilty. Yes, I mean, how do I know she really doesn't have a lump in her breast this time? Maybe I really am being cruel to her. So you're never really sure whether you're the victim or the victimizer in this ritual, just as in the dream. You're right, Angela agreed. I always feel guilty. The key element in the dream seems to be the evil nature of the ritual, I commented. What do you think it is about this ritual interaction that you have with your mother that makes it evil? Angela looked pained. I don't know. That I'm being cruel to my mother? Angela, how much money does your mother have? I asked. I don't really have any idea. But you do know she owns 3 apartment buildings in Chicago. Free and clear, right? Well, they're not very large, Angela protested. If I remember rightly, I said, they have about 10 apartments each. And they're in a good neighborhood, correct? Angela nodded. So what do you think they're worth? $500,000? I suppose so, Angela responded grudgingly. But you know I don't think about money very clearly. Yes, I agreed. I think that's one way you avoid seeing the obvious. Do you think maybe they might even be worth $1 million? Well, I guess it's possible. Yet I continued, your mother acts as if it were a great burden to loan you $1,000 so that you and her grandchild can have a car to get around in. She's really quite a wealthy woman, but she talks poverty. And when she talks poverty, she's talking a lie, isn't she? Yes, I guess that's why I get so angry at her, Angela acknowledged. Angela, whenever there is evil, there's a lie around, I remarked. Evil always has something to do with lies. What makes this ritual interaction between you and your mother evil is that it's based on a lie. Not your lie. Your mother's lie. But my mother's not evil, Angela exclaimed. Why do you say that? Because she's my mother. I know she's sick, but she can't be evil. What's the difference between sick and evil? I asked. I'm not sure, Angela answered unhappily. I'm not sure either, Angela. In fact, I think that evil is probably a kind of sickness. But it is a particular kind of sickness. And calling it a sickness doesn't make it not evil. Whether it's a sickness or not, I think that evil's very real. And I think you have to come to terms with that reality. Your dream suggests that in relating with your mother, you are relating with evil. I think that, together, you and I must squarely face the issue of whether or not your mother is evil, and just what that means, what it has meant for you in the past, and what it will mean for you in the future. To fully appreciate the forces acting on Angela, and even more on the young woman in the next case vignette, it is necessary that we turn our attention once again to the phenomenon of narcissism. All of us tend to be more or less self-centered in our dealings with others. We usually view any given situation first and foremost from the standpoint of how it affects us personally, and only as an afterthought do we bother to consider how the same situation might affect someone else involved. Not so those who are evil. Theirs is a brand of narcissism so total that they seem to lack, in whole or in part, this capacity for empathy. Angela's mother apparently did not stop to think that Angela might not want her hair dyed blonde, any more than Bobby's parents, described in Book 1, stopped to think how he would feel being given his brother's suicide weapon for Christmas. In addition to the fact that the evil need victims to sacrifice to their narcissism permits them to ignore the humanity of their victims as well. The blindness of the narcissist to others can extend even beyond a lack of empathy. Narcissists may not see others at all. Each of us is unique. Our uniqueness makes of each of us an I entity, provides each of us with a separate identity. There are boundaries to the individual soul, and in our dealings with each other, we generally respect these boundaries. We must know where we end and others begin. When Angela's mother dyed her daughter's hair, she was behaving as if Angela did not even exist. Angela, as a distinct, unique individual, with a will and tastes of her own, had no reality for her mother. She did not see Angela as Angela. She would have engulfed the entirety of Angela's self into her narcissistic ego, had Angela not been able to retreat behind a moat of silence. Growing up, Angela was able to preserve her boundaries only by making them excessive, but then had to pay the price of isolation from others as a result. Another form of devastation that narcissistic intrusiveness can cause is the symbiotic relationship. Symbiosis, as we use the term in psychiatry, refers to a mutually parasitic and destructive coupling. In the symbiotic relationship, neither partner will separate from the other, even though it would obviously be beneficial to each if they could. Hartley and Sarah clearly had such a relationship. Hartley, the weak one, could not have survived in his infantile state without Sarah to make his every decision for him. But Sarah also could not have survived psychologically without Hartley's weakness to feed her narcissistic need for domination and superiority. They functioned not as two separate individuals, but as a single unit. Since Hartley and Sarah, two middle-aged adults, had, quote, succeeded, unquote, in effecting a symbiotic relationship, it is hardly surprising that certain evil and narcissistic parents can succeed in cultivating such a relationship with a child destined to come under their domination. The case vignette that follows describes the lengthy healing and hence the weaning away of one such child from a symbiotic relationship with her mother. I have called it the case of the spider phobia. To this day, I cannot understand how it was that Billy remained in therapy. The fact that she did is an enormous tribute to both the genius of her therapist and the genius of Billy herself. It was a sort of miracle. Billy was taken to a colleague of mine by her mother because of academic underachievement. 16 at the time and very bright, she was doing poorly in school. After 6 months of therapy, Billy's grades had improved slightly. She had also clearly developed a certain attachment to her therapist, a mature and kindly man of infinite patience. At this point, her mother stated that the problem was solved, but Billy wanted to continue in therapy. Her mother refused to pay for it. Her therapist reduced the already minimum fee to $5 a session. Billy, whose allowance was $5 a week, began paying him out of her own money. Soon her mother stopped her allowance. Billy got her first job during her senior year of high school in order to continue to pay for her therapy. That was 7 years ago. Billy is still in therapy, but the end is in sight. One of the reasons it is so remarkable that Billy stayed in therapy, paying for it out of her allowance, then out of her meager salary, is that for the first 3 years, Billy did not feel that there was anything the matter with her. On some unconscious level, she must have known that something was radically wrong, but consciously she was utterly cool about her problems. She vaguely wished she could get better grades, yet she was perfectly ready to acknowledge she almost never did her homework. This she blandly attributed to laziness. And after all, aren't many high school kids lazy? The only thing that could possibly be identified as a symptom was her fear of spiders. Billy hated spiders. Any spider. Whenever she saw a spider, she literally ran away in panic. If she noticed a spider in the house, no matter how minuscule or harmless appearing, she wouldn't stay in the house unless someone killed and removed it. But this phobia was ego-syntonic. While she recognized that almost everybody was much less afraid of spiders than she, Billy concluded that this was because others were insensitive. If they appreciated how really horrible spiders were, then they would be just as afraid as she was. During the first 3 years of therapy, Billy passionately hated her father and adored her mother. A lifelong bank clerk, her father was a shy and taciturn man who seemed to Billy as cold and distant as her mother was warm and close. Billy, the only child, and her mother were companions. They confided in each other their closest secrets. Her mother always had several lovers, and throughout her adolescence, Billy liked nothing better than to listen to her mother's tales of her extramarital affairs. They seemed a natural response to her husband's isolated, unaffectionate personality, and Billy and her mother, like gleeful co-conspirators, were united in their hatred of him. And her mother was as eager to listen to all the sexual and romantic details of Billy's life. Billy considered herself very fortunate to have such a loving and interested mother. However, she was not able to explain why her mother refused to pay for her therapy. But she was hardly able or willing to criticize her in this regard. Whenever the issue was raised by her therapist, Billy sidestepped vigorously. When Billy told her mother about her own boyfriends, there was a lot to tell. Billy was frankly promiscuous. It was not, however, that Billy wanted to be promiscuous. On the contrary, she yearned painfully for a deep and lasting relationship with a man. But it never seemed to work out. She would fall head over heels in love with a man, almost immediately move into his apartment. But within a few days or a few weeks, the relationship invariably soured, and Billy was back at home with her parents. Beautiful, intelligent, and charming, Billy never had difficulty finding new lovers. Within a week, she would be in love again. But as always, within a few more weeks, the relationship would be dead. Billy faintly began to wonder if somehow she killed these relationships. It was this bit of wonder and her pain at being unable to hold on to her lovers that caused Billy to begin working more seriously in therapy. Very gradually, the basis of the pattern emerged. Billy couldn't tolerate being alone. Having fallen in love with a man, she would want to go with him wherever he went. She would always sleep with him, whether or not she felt sexual, because that would guarantee that he would stay with her, at least for the night. When they awoke in the morning, she would plead with him not to go to work. He would have to tear himself away from her. Inevitably, the man would feel suffocated. He would start to break dates. She would redouble her efforts to cling to him. He would feel more suffocated. Finally, on some excuse, he would terminate the relationship. Billy then would fall in love with whoever was closest at hand, cling to him immediately, and the vicious cycle would repeat itself. Once her fear of being alone was uncovered, it also became clear why Billy had been an underachiever in school. To read a book or write a paper requires solitude. Billy had been unable to do her homework because she had been unwilling to tear herself away from people, particularly from her mother, who was always ready for a chat, long enough to carry out an assignment. Although it was now identified as a problem, Billy felt helpless to do anything about it. She recognized that her terror of aloneness limited her in certain ways. But what could be done? It was part of her nature. Self-destructive though the pattern might be, it was just the way she was. So nothing changed, except that her phobia of spiders became worse. She would no longer walk down a shaded street at night, lest she inadvertently brush against a spider. At this point, her therapist took a bold step. He insisted that Billy get an apartment of her own. She refused. How could she possibly afford it? Now that she was working steadily, the therapist had raised her fee from $5 a session to his standard rate of $25. That was more than $100 a month she was paying him, a quarter of her salary. He offered to reduce his fee again to $5 an hour. Billy claimed she still couldn't afford it. Besides, what would happen if she found a spider in her apartment one night and she was all alone? What would she do then? No, an apartment of her own was out of the question. My colleague pointed out to her that she was doing absolutely nothing to deal with her fear of being alone. Unless she took some step to actually choose aloneness, he saw no hope for her therapy. He would refuse to see her anymore unless she got an apartment. She raved at his cruelty. He remained adamant. So finally, in the 4th year of her therapy, Billy rented her own apartment. 3 things immediately happened. One was that Billy became more aware of just what a compelling force her fear of aloneness was. On nights when she was not with a lover, she became extremely anxious in her empty apartment. By 9 in the evening, she could no longer tolerate it and would drive back to her mother's house to chat and then sleep there. On weekends, when she had nothing to do, she spent the entire time with her parents. During the first 6 months of renting her apartment, she slept there alone on no more than half a dozen occasions. She was paying for an apartment that she was too frightened to use. It was absurd. She became annoyed with herself. She began to think that maybe, just maybe, this fear of aloneness was really sick. The second thing that happened was that a change seemed to come over her father. When she announced that she was going to get her own apartment, he suggested that perhaps she would like to have some furniture he had inherited, which was sitting unused in a barn. Then, on her moving day, he borrowed a truck from one of his friends and helped her load and unload the furniture. He gave her a bottle of champagne for her housewarming. Once she was settled in, he began a pattern of making her a present of some small object for the apartment every month or so. A new lamp, a print to hang on the wall, a bath mat, a fruit bowl, a set of kitchen knives. These gifts were given unostentatiously, quietly dropped off at her place of work. But Billy realized that they were chosen with care. They were all in good taste. She had not thought of her father as having good taste, and she knew he had little extra money to spare for such things. Although he remained shy and withdrawn and difficult to talk to, for the first time she could remember, Billy was quite touched by his interest in her. She wondered if the interest, subtle though it was, might not have been there all along. In relation to the apartment, Billy's mother was as unhelpful as her father was generous. Several times Billy asked her mother for little odds and ends that had been tucked away in corners of the family house, but suddenly her mother seemed to have developed a use for them. Her mother never asked her about the new apartment. In fact, Billy began to notice that whenever she mentioned the apartment, her mother seemed to be annoyed, even cutting. "Don't you think you're being just a bit self-centered, talking about your apartment this and your apartment that all the time?" she said on one occasion. Slowly it dawned on Billy that her mother did not want her to move out of the family home. This was the third thing that happened. It was a thing that snowballed. At first, Billy rather enjoyed the fact that her mother was upset about her moving out. Didn't that show how much her mother loved her? And wasn't it nice to always be welcomed back at the family home? To have her mother to chat with late into the night? To have her old bedroom always ready for her? Not to have to return to her lonely apartment with the possibility of spiders in the dark? But the magic began to go out of this bit by bit. For one thing, she and her mother no longer had Billy's father to talk against. When her mother railed against him as usual, Billy began to say, "Come on, Mom, he's really not that bad. Sometimes I think he's even kind of sweet." This sort of response seemed to inflame her mother. Immediately her mother's remarks about her father would become positively vicious, or else she would turn around and start attacking Billy for not being sympathetic. These moments had become distinctly unpleasant. Finally, Billy had to ask her mother not to talk against her father when they were together, since it invariably ended in a quarrel. Her mother grudgingly complied, but without their mutual enemy, Billy and her mother had much less to talk about. Then there was the matter of Wednesday evenings. Billy was an office manager for a small publishing company. Every Thursday morning, it made a single large weekly shipment to other parts of the country. The nature of Billy's responsibilities required her to be in the office by 6 o'clock on those mornings. Whenever she spent the night at her parents' house, it somehow seemed impossible, chatting away with her mother, to get to bed before midnight. The result was that on Thursday mornings, Billy invariably felt wretched from lack of sleep. With the help of her therapist, she made a vow that on Wednesday nights, on just that one night, if no other night of the week, she would sleep alone in her apartment and would be back there no later than 9 o'clock in the evening. For the first 10 weeks, Billy was unable to keep her vow. She was never able to be back in her apartment before midnight. Each week her therapist would ask her how well she had fulfilled her vow, and each week Billy had to confess failure. First, she was furious at her therapist. Then she was furious with herself for not being able to stick to her resolution. She began to look seriously at her weakness. For several sessions, she talked about her ambivalence about the vow, her fear of the loneliness of her apartment, her desire to remain in the warmth of the family home. At this point, her therapist asked Billy if she thought there was any way her mother might be able to help her keep the vow. Billy was delighted with the idea. She immediately told her mother about the vow and requested her encouragement to leave the house by 8:30 on Wednesday evenings. Her mother refused. "What you and that therapist of yours do is your business, not mine," she said. Billy felt there was a certain amount of truth in this, but she also began to suspect that her mother might have reasons of her own for not wanting Billy to keep the vow. The suspicion grew, and as it grew, Billy began to observe her mother's behavior on Wednesday nights. She noted that invariably around 8:30, her mother would bring up some particularly provocative topic for discussion. Once she recognized this pattern, Billy tried to interrupt it. At 8:45, in the middle of one such topic, Billy stood up and announced that she had to leave. "Don't you think you're being rude?" her mother asked. She reminded her mother of her vow and suggested that even if it wasn't her mother's responsibility to help her keep it, perhaps it was her responsibility at least to respect it. They got into a heated argument. Her mother cried. It was after midnight when Billy got back to her apartment. Thereafter, Billy observed that if her mother's genius for bringing up a provocative topic at 8:30 failed to have an effect, she would then demonstrate an equal genius for starting an argument. By the 14th week of her still unkept vow, this pattern too had become clear to Billy. That Wednesday night, at 8:30, her mother started a story. Billy stood up, saying she was sorry she didn't have time to hear it. Her mother began to argue. Billy announced she didn't have time to argue either. She moved to the door. Her mother literally clutched at her sleeve. Billy tore herself away. She was in her apartment at the stroke of 9. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. It was her mother. Billy had left in such a hurry, she said, she hadn't had time to tell her that the doctor thought that she maybe had gallstones. Billy's fear of spiders became even worse. At this point, Billy still adored her mother. In therapy, she had become able to criticize her mother quite freely and accurately. Yet she was never actually angry, and she continued to take every possible opportunity to be in her mother's company. It was as if she had developed two brains, a new one that could look at her mother objectively, coexisting with the old one that remained utterly unchanged. Her therapist pressed forward. It was not just on Wednesday evenings, he suggested, that her mother clung to her. Perhaps her mother didn't want Billy to leave her or develop a separate existence in any dimension. He reminded her once again that her mother had refused to pay for her therapy as soon as it had become important in Billy's life. Could it be that her mother was jealous of Billy's attachment to therapy because it was an attachment to something other than herself? And why had she so resented Billy's getting her own apartment? Might she not resent Billy's developing any independence and separation? Maybe so, Billy countered. But her mother had never objected to her having boyfriends and lovers. Didn't this indicate that her mother had no desire to hold on to her? Perhaps, her therapist acknowledged. But then it might also indicate simply that her mother wanted Billy to be a carbon copy of herself. Perhaps her mother used Billy's promiscuity to justify her own. Besides, the more alike the two of them were, the less the chance they would ever separate. And so the struggle went on, week after week, month after month, endlessly back and forth over the same issues, with no sign of resolution in sight. But a subtly enormous change did occur in the 6th year of her therapy. Billy began to write poetry. At first, she showed her poems to her mother. Her mother was not particularly interested, but Billy was proud of her poetry. It was a new, surprising dimension of herself. It was uniquely her, something her own. She bought an elegant leather-bound volume in which to record her poems. The urge to write did not come often, but when it did, it was compelling. For the first time in her life, when she was working on a poem, Billy found she enjoyed being alone. Indeed, she had to be alone. She couldn't concentrate in her parents' house, with her mother's constant interruptions. So when the urge hit her, she would suddenly stand up and announce that she had to return to her apartment. "But it's not Wednesday night," her mother would shriek. And Billy would have to tear herself away from her mother once again. It was after one such episode, when she was describing to her therapist how her mother had clutched at her as she was leaving to write, that Billy commented, "She was like a goddamn spider." "I've been waiting a long time for you to say that," her therapist exclaimed. Say what? That your mother's like a spider. So? You hate and fear spiders. I don't hate my mother, and I don't fear her either. Maybe you should, but I don't want to. So you hate and fear spiders instead? Billy missed her next appointment. When she returned, her therapist suggested she had skipped the appointment because she was angry at him for making a connection between her mother and her spider phobia. Billy missed the next 2 appointments. But when she finally came back, she was ready to face it. All right, she said. So I've got a phobia. What is a phobia anyway? How does it work? Phobias are the result of displacement, her therapist explained. They occur when a normal fear or revulsion toward something is displaced onto something else. People employ this defensive displacement because they do not want to acknowledge the original fear or revulsion. In Billy's case, she didn't want to acknowledge her mother's evil. Naturally. What child would want to think of her mother as malicious or destructive? Like any child, Billy wanted to believe that her mother loved her, that her mother was safe and kind and good. But to believe this, she somehow had to get rid of the fear and revulsion she instinctively felt toward her mother's evil. She did this by directing the fear and revulsion toward the spiders. Spiders were the evil ones, not her mother. But my mother is not evil, Billy proclaimed. It was true that her mother was not keen on her becoming independent, she admitted, and that she used all manner of wiles and trickery to try to keep Billy from developing a fully separate existence. But this was not a matter of evil. It was just because her mother was lonely. And she, Billy, understood about loneliness. It was terrible to feel lonely. It was also human. Humans are social creatures. They need each other. The fact that her mother clung to her from loneliness was hardly evil. It was only human. While loneliness is human, her therapist responded, the inability to tolerate it is hardly a necessary part of the human condition. He went on to explain that it was the task of parents to assist their children to achieve their own independence and separateness. In order to succeed in this task, it was essential for parents to tolerate their own loneliness so as to allow and even encourage their children to eventually leave them. Instead, to discourage such separation not only represented a failure in the parental task, but a sacrificing of the child's growth to the parent's own immature, self-centered desires. It was destructive. Yes, he thought, it was evil, and Billy was right to be afraid of it. Slowly, Billy came to see it, and the more she saw it, the more her eyes were opened. She began to notice hundreds of infinitely subtle ways in which her mother continually attempted to retain her spirit in her clutches. Yet little changed. Billy, now 23, still spent most nights sleeping in her parents' house, and most of her free time with her mother. And the pattern of her relationships with men continued unaltered. The falling in love, the clinging, the suffocating, the breaking up, the frantic searching, the falling in love again, man after man, time after time. And she was just as terrified of spiders as ever. The hard part was yet to come. Nothing's happening, Billy complained in therapy one day. It's been 7 years I've been seeing you. What the hell more do I have to do? Figure out why you still have your spider phobia. I've recognized that my mother is a spider, Billy replied. Then why do you keep dropping into her lair and web? You know, like her, I'm lonely. Her therapist looked at Billy. He hoped she was ready. So maybe, in part, you too are a spider. Billy sobbed for the remainder of the session. But the next session she was there, right on time, even eager for the painful work ahead. It was true. She felt like a spider sometimes. When men started to leave her, she clutched at them, just as her mother clutched at her. She hated them for going. She didn't care about their feelings. She didn't care about them. She wanted them for herself. Yes, it was like something evil in her, an evil urge, an evil part of her taking over. The spider phobia had not only helped her to deny her mother's evil, she had used it to deny the evil in herself. It was all so connected and intertwined. She had identified with her mother. They were so much the same. How could she genuinely fight against her mother's evil, unless at the same time she fought against herself? How could she condemn her mother for holding on to her without condemning herself for refusing to tolerate her own loneliness? How could she stop trying to trap men in her own web, men who ought to stand free and tall and strong, just as she ought to stand free and tall and strong? The problem was not how to extricate herself from her mother's web anymore, since her mother's identity was so much hers. The problem was how to extricate herself from herself. And how in God's name do you do that? But Billy is doing it. In the name of God or her true self, she is somehow beginning to separate from her mother, to definitely break free from their symbiotic relationship. In her leather-bound book, she recently wrote, "Amazing to me how your disease pops up in me all the time, part of my very being, without me even knowing. So hard to fight an enemy one can't see. So scary to think you're in me, so incorporated into my thinking and feeling that it is indistinguishable from me. It is me. I feel like a mulatto who is part of the Ku Klux Klan, hating the very essence of part of me, working on eradicating a part of myself. This is probably the hardest thing that I will ever do. Sometimes it feels so unnatural. I often wonder how it is that I became different from you, to have the will to want to be different from you."
People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil was written and read by M. Scott Peck. It was abridged for audio by Judith Benenson. The recording engineer was Rick Bradley. The editor was Julie Burstein. Post-production by Paul Fowley. The associate producer was Elisa Shokoff. People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil was directed and produced by Carol Shapiro.